Renaming constraints. Very simple. Alter table, table name, rename constraint, old name to new name. It can actually be quite useful. Let's go into, let's say, my ACT table. As you can see, I have these ugly constraint names here. Typically, I name all my foreign keys and primary keys. Quite often in some databases, you'll find the foreign keys aren't named specifically. But I could, for instance, go into my ACT table, and if I bring up the ACT table, I actually have a check constraint called this on ACT ID not null. What would I do with that? Well, I would probably do something like this if I can find the right window, and let's just put a mark in there so we know where we are. Control V, alter, table, ACT. Let's go back to the syntax. Modify constraint. No, not modify. Rename constraint. Modify implies constraint states. Rename constraint. And we're actually looking at the table name. So this is the name of the constraint. We need to take this. This is a uniquely generated constraint name generated by Oracle. Rename constraint 2. And it's ACT. Probably ACT ID null, something like that. Oracle generated this name when I specified the field as being not null. So if I go into the ACT table, and I actually can go to the SQL tab, and it will generate a script for me that could be used to regenerate this table, which is another useful feature of SQL Developer. Can take a while, and it does add a lot of extra fluff that you don't want to get confused with. But here, if you can see, I have not null. It doesn't actually specify the name of the constraint for not null in here because that's internalized. But here you can see primary key, unique key, and so on and so forth. But let's go back to the columns and the constraints, and here's the constraint name. What I want to do I want to run this, click the play button, it says it's altered. Let's go back to the ACT table, and I have to see if I can actually refresh this on the screen there. No, it doesn't work. It needs you to actually reopen the table again, I think. So open this table again and go back to the constraints, and as you can see, I've actually renamed that. So I could go to this one as well and rename the null constraint name on the name field as well. So let's just copy this just for fun. It's nice to get all your constraint names and all your metadata named in sensible ways, because then when you look it up later on, not really too necessary with null specifiers, but for other things like foreign keys, primary keys, it's quite often a good idea. And there we go. And we'll chuck this out again. And let's just open this up, and yeah, I didn't have to refresh it. So let's change those names. That's interesting and useful. So now let's go and look at drop-in constraints. Well, drop constraints. Now I could do a lot of damage here. So let's go and drop a simple constraint. Let's go and drop the constraint of a foreign key pointing to the ACT table on the show table. In fact, no, let's not do that. I don't want to do that. I'm going to take these two commands. Well, what I actually did here was I did actually drop a foreign key from here. And as you can see, there is now no ACT ID foreign key pointing from the show table back to the ACT table. I can add it again. I just don't want to mess up my data structure. And I can bring this out again, and I can open this up here, and if I go back to the constraints, I should have the ACT table foreign key pointer again. Okay, so that's fairly simple.